and welcome back to my channel. My name is Becca. If you haven't been here before, welcome. So today's video is going to be another analysis of Hulu's Only Murders in the Building, Season 4, Episode 8, Lifeboat. And if you haven't watched up to Season 4, Episode 8, then do not watch this video. There will definitely be spoilers. I'm going to be talking about it openly. I have other videos for every episode this season and the last couple of seasons, and I will link it up above if I remember to, but it's in a playlist called Who's Only Murders in the Building, so you can go check that out. I would suggest watching some of the other videos from this season because I come up with different theories for each episode, and I don't always repeat them just because it can be really long-winded to repeat every theory that I've got. But I talk about all the different clues in each episode, and I just think it's a good time, so definitely go check those out. If you like this kind of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification, all that good YouTube stuff. It really helps me. I'm trying to hit 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year. With that being said, let's get on into the video. And as I said, this episode is episode 8, which normally means that we're getting a little bit closer to who the killer or killers are, and it also means that a lot of things are being revealed to us. By episode 8, I feel like normally we have at least one of the mysteries solved for the season. Like for season 2, when episode 8 came out, we learned that Krebs was Glitter Guy. So that kind of confirmation, we start to get a hold of what's going on and understand everything, because 9, I feel like we may or may not actually meet the murderer, and then 10 is to wrap everything up. So let's get into it. First of all, Lifeboat is a movie, just like every other episode of this season is named after a real movie. And Lifeboat is basically about a group of people. I think most of them are American, UK, and the rest are Germans, and it's during a war, and basically both boats on either side get sunk. These people get into a lifeboat. They end up pulling in a, German man, which was a big, should we let him stay or not, because he's from the other side. And so it's just a movie about a struggle of these people trying to survive in this one lifeboat. They're from different walks of life. They don't have a lot to relate to each other with, but because of their circumstances, they've been thrown together. And this kind of relates a little bit to the way that Dudenoff has pulled the Westies together. And I think it could also kind of relate to the fact that we have the one faction of the Westies and the other faction of the actors. And so we kind of have these two opposing sides. And in this episode, we do see them all come together. So first of all, Dudenoff is narrating this episode. He is the voice. He talks about Lifeboat and relates it back to the way he's giving out these affordable apartments in this nice building in order to help kind of save these people that he's met, that he cares about, that he wants to help with their dreams. We see Vince come in and meet Rudy in the hallway of the West Tower, and Dudenoff has invited them over to play a card game. We also see the SAZZ family and Helga, and they've all come over to Dudenoff's, and he says he's going to change their lives. So we flip back to the trio. They're returning to the city, and Charles says, "One thing about being in a safe house full of family is it makes returning to an apartment of murderers more appealing." Ha ha. So because his sister is so crazy and dealing with his family is so difficult, he's more than happy to return to the Arconia. Aphrodite breaks down, and the actors keep calling the trio, trying to insert themselves into the mystery because they helped out last episode. And the trio still think that the Westies are responsible for murdering Dudenoff and SAZZ, but Mabel makes a good point of she doesn't really understand why they would kill Dudenoff if he was their key to free apartment living. So they're trying to figure this out, and they end up deciding that the trio and the actors will meet on the set of the movie in what looks like Charles's apartment to discuss further the information that they know about the Westies and the case. We see that Charles is upset because the set of his apartment isn't organized how he would set it up. He's volume 1 next to volume 2. This is outrageous. And we also see them unveil a fake murder board, which is obviously going along with the movie. Eugene mentions a plan to have the Westies spill their story to Tony Danza, and he says that Danza is the perfect planza. But obviously no one really agrees with him, so they decide instead that they're going to invite the Westies over to Oliver's apartment with the actors in the trio there, and they're going to see if they can get them to confess. Eva Longoria also tells the trio to do a ding-dong, which is basically a big surprise that would kind of throw the Westies off their game. She relates this back to like a soap opera bringing in an uncle who was in a coma for a while, just like showing up at someone's house. This kind of like very dramatic and wild storyline that no one is expecting. Charles begins to get really upset because he really wants to solve SAZZ's murder, and as we know from last episode, he has a really hard time processing his emotions and like showing his emotions. His sister kind of calls him out on that a few times, and it's still true for this episode where he has a really hard time showing how angry and frustrated he is and the grief that he feels for the fact that SAZZ is gone. We also meet the Lady Longoria, which is Eva Longoria's multi-tool, which has a recorder. We learn that Oliver is organizing the wedding, and this is obviously going to be in the last 2 episodes of the season. Hopefully this time a wedding actually takes place. As we know, Charles and Joy were supposed to get married and then all that went south. So it would actually be really exciting to see one of the trio get married. And Zach asks him how it's going to happen and says that he and his wife get married quarterly and that Oliver can't just get married at a courthouse because it'll just lead to a divorce. And he seems kind of disappointed because he feels like Oliver isn't being the romantic that he knows that he is. Eugene goes up to Charles separately and asks if he's okay. And Charles basically says that he is angry, but that he suppresses his emotions. And he uses breathing and room straightening because emotions are not socially acceptable. And Eugene tries to trigger him into some sort of angry emotional reaction, mainly because he wants to figure out how to fully play Charles on the screen in the movie. And so he's kind of using this to his advantage, but Charles really doesn't budge. Next, we go to the big scene. The Westies, the trio, and the actors all meet up in Oliver's apartment to play, well, I'm assuming to play a game of Oh Hell. And as the Westies come in, they lock the door and cover it with their like bellhop like scooter thingamajig, which is holding a leg of ham, and they pull out a knife. So the Westies collect everyone's phones and say they know that the trio knows about the checks, and they make them sit down so that they can tell them their story. And Mabel basically says, oh, they're trying to humanize themselves so that we feel bad for them. They're going to tell us their like villain origin story arc, you know, before they murder us or whatever. So we get the origin story of Dudenoff meeting the SAZZ family from their restaurant, and they would often make deliveries to him after his wife died, and so he started inviting them over to play cards every Friday. Rudy goes on to explain that he met Dudenoff, as we know, in a film class, and he basically did a monologue from the movie A Few Good Men, and Dudenoff told him that he was very talented and invited him to come over to his apartment as well. And of course, because they mentioned the movie A Few Good Men, I thought it would be good to give you guys a summary of what the movie is about. So as far as I can tell, this movie is about 2 officers who are charged with murder in a military hierarchy situation for killing another soldier. And basically they are going to court, and the theory that the defense has is that these 2 people didn't carry out this order on their own. They carried it out based on someone else telling them to do it. And so I think this is interesting because it seems to us that whoever is the murderer may have had an accomplice, because as we know, there were supposedly 2 people who helped to commit this murder, and most likely there's one who's in charge and one who is kind of like directing the orders of what's going on. That's kind of how it was in season 2, with Krebs not committing the murder, but being a part of the scheme, and then Poppy or Becky Butler actually doing the murder herself and planning everything out. But I do think that maybe this is to signify that whoever we find guilty at the end of this episode, because we do kind of find something out, that maybe they were a part of the plan, but they are not the mastermind. So Rudy does the entire monologue from this movie scene, and then goes on to explain that he learned about ham radios from Dudenoff, and ultimately all of the Westies got them. And Dudenoff asked Rudy, if your life were a movie, what would be your happy ending? And Rudy says that he wants to stay in the city and keep trying to be successful, which goes on to show that like Dudenoff really wanted to help support the Westies because New York City is so expensive. He wanted to give them the opportunity to live somewhere that was a reasonable price while also pursuing their dreams. Eugene points out that the only person left to have committed the murder is Charles's friend Vince, and that he probably betrayed him. And he's once again trying to agitate Charles into some sort of like angry action or like emotional response. Vince goes on to explain that he joined the film class after his wife passed away because he didn't want to be one of those lonely old men. And we see them watching It's a Wonderful Life, which is like this classic film about family and money. And basically this man is working for a company. He ends up losing out on a lot of money, and he kind of is trying to figure out how he can pay it back. There's a moment where he thinks about possibly killing himself in order to give his family the like insurance money from his death. And then he ends up deciding that like that's not worth it. And he kind of like goes back to his family, and it's a happy ending. And like the evil guy in the film ends up completely alone. So it's another movie about family and the importance of family and not being alone. Dudenoff says that the movie is timeless due to the perfect casting, but some of the young kids in his class don't agree, and they say that it's about capitalism and corporate America, which, you know, kind of is. But Vince retorts that the point of the movie, like I said, is that this man isn't alone. He gets to be with his family, and this other greedy old man who kind of like robbed him out of all his like savings ends up completely alone, even if he is rich. We see Dudenoff and Vince watching Lifeboat together and talking about how much basically the youths in this class suck. And then we see them all join the card game, and we learn that Dudenoff's wife used to be a music teacher, and so every time a room opened up on the floor, they would get it so that she could have another rehearsal space for one of her students, and sometimes she would let students stay there when they came on hard times. And so after she passed, Dudenoff ended up basically in an empty hall in this building with all of this apartment space and like no one to take it. And so that's when he decided to give it to the Westies in order to make himself a family and a community, a casting for this movie that is his life, and also so that he didn't end up alone. So in the end of this like monologue where the Westies are kind of threatening the trio and the actors, they say that Dudenoff is definitely in Portugal. And then Charles is like, it's time for a ding dong. And who shows up but Helga? And she's kind of been the missing piece this whole time. So she tells her side of the story, basically says that she met Dudenoff when she was a locksmith because her father passed away and gave her his company. And she's fixing his door because he keeps losing his keys. They listen to Perfect Strangers together, and he's kind of like, oh, this is before your time. And she's like, no, I know what this is. And so they have a bonding moment, and he decides that the code for the door should be oh hell. And she says, oh, like the card game. And that's where he decides to invite her into his little family, little community that he's got. So they have the Friday night cards game, and Helga's like, yeah, he turned a bunch of perfect strangers into a family. And then we go on to see that Helga found a note from Dudenoff saying that he was off to Portugal, and then the power surged, which she knew had to do with the old incinerator being turned on, but she didn't connect the dots at that moment. The Westies then started to freeze her out, and that's when she started to become suspicious of what had happened to Dudenoff. They all seemed really stressed about the podcast that the trio had just started making, and she started to think that it was possible that maybe the Westies actually murdered Dudenoff and incinerated him, and that's why they were freezing her out and why they were so upset that the trio's podcast had come out. Helga heard the podcast and thought that the unexplained threats to the trio could actually be coming from one of the Westies. And so Mabel ends up pulling out Dudenoff's prosthetic shoulder and saying, like, this is proof that he is not in Portugal, he's dead. And Eugene stands up and he starts to get really upset and try and trigger Charles again to have some sort of emotional reaction. And he says, they incinerated your friend, Charles. Like, aren't you upset? And finally, Charles has this, like, breakdown and he goes wordless and he starts, like, moving things around the table and, like, making it, like, unorganized. And he starts, like, gasping and shaking his hands. And Eugene's like, I know what he's saying. He's really put out that, you know, his best friend was murdered and that, like, you guys are responsible, basically. And Vince is like, okay, we'll tell you the truth. We'll tell you what actually happened. And so he goes into his apartment and he pulls out an old roll of film. And so he shows the note that everyone got the night Dudenoff disappeared, basically inviting the Westies to come to his funeral. And when they went to the basement, they found out that Dudenoff was actually ill and had decided to kill himself and have the Westies burn the body so that they could continue to keep the rent-controlled apartments going. Because if he had died, people had gotten involved, the apartments would have been taken away, split up, and, like, sold to whoever. And the rent scheme would have been found out, and maybe even the Westies would have gotten in trouble for it. So he decides this is the best course of action in order to allow them to stay together. So he asks the Westies to cash his social security checks, and he tells them to tell everyone that he moved to Portugal. And he didn't want Helga involved because she had such a hard time when her father passed away. He didn't want to evoke those, like, same emotions from her, so that's why she was left out of it. And we actually see the video that Dudenoff shot that night, and his admissions, basically, that the Westies are not killers. Now, of course, you could say, oh my gosh, like, they had, you know, a gun to his head, you know, one out of screen that we couldn't see, and that he was, you know, told that he had to say this stuff, and then he was killed. But it doesn't seem like that's what happened. So the Westies all apologize to Helga for freezing her out, and they invite her to move back in with them. They say that they really miss her. And as the trio is leaving and the actors are leaving, Eva Longoria pulls out her multi-tool and is like, and we recorded the whole thing. And Mabel ends up saying, you know what, no, we're not going to use that for the podcast because I'm not going to tear apart a found family, because her, Charles, and Oliver are a found family. And, you know, she's not going to force the Westies apart. She's not going to be the reason that they don't get to be together. We also see Zach tell Oliver that he booked him a wedding on the top of the Empire State Building and that he's really upset that Oliver isn't the romantic he thought he was. And Oliver tells him that he and Loretta are going to get married at the Arconia. And he says, this is where we fell in love, and I want a marriage where we fall in love every day for the rest of our very long lives. And Zach is relieved that Oliver is romantic and kisses him. So this definitely has to be a part of at least one of the next episodes where Oliver and Loretta are getting married. And I'm really excited to see it. Just like I said before, I think it's going to be such a fun opportunity. We've actually seen Mabel in a wedding dress, and we've seen Charles almost get married, so this would be a real time that we get to see one of the trio actually get married, which would be very exciting. Charles thanks Eugene for getting him in touch with his emotions, and Eugene promises not to alienate Charles's audience by putting any of it in the movie, which, you know, is pretty generous, I guess. And Mabel stays behind. She goes back to Dudenoff's apartment, and she ends up drawing a pig. And she draws it on the wall the way that she used to do artwork in her aunt's apartment. And I think that this is nice because something that we've been searching for or at least something I've been searching for in the series, is nods back to the season 1 trio. The version of Mabel that was really passionate about art and wanted to and was drawing on the walls and drawing pictures of Tim Kono. We haven't seen that in a while, so it's really nice to get nods back to who the trio really are, kind of coming back to the characters themselves, because I do feel like in season 3 we got a little bit farther away from that. We had a lot of guest stars We have had a lot of guest stars in this season as well, and sometimes that's scary because it gets us away from like what the show genuinely is, and it just enters it into this category of like stardom, and that's not why we all started watching Only Murders. We started watching it because of season 1 and like the cozy mystery vibes and like the found family vibes and who the trio was and who they were together and the growth we saw in them. So that's very exciting to see her draw like that. It just brings back those memories. Dudenoff says that the film Lifeboat is really about found family and fighting together for survival. And we can see that that's basically what the Westies have been doing ever since Dudenoff died, is fighting to stay together, fighting to keep up the ruse that Dudenoff is in Portugal so that they don't have to lose each other. And we also see that the trio is kind of back to square one until they get a knock on the door, and it's Helga who arrives with Hammy. And we learn that Howard is very angry that Helga has come back to claim Hammy, which is unfortunate because I feel bad for Howard. Like, he's spent so much time with this pig. I'm sure he's disappointed to have her leave. But luckily, Helga will just be on the other side of the Arconia, so he can go visit. But Helga ends up saying that she did know SAZZ through the ham radio, and SAZZ was asking about the plot holes and talked about a stuntman who was her protege working on a movie called Project Ronkonkoma. And the stuntman had messed up really bad and was harassing her, and SAZZ had said to Helga that he was going to be the death of her. And then they look up the stuntman, and of course it is Glenn Stubbins. And we see them zoom in on him. He's like in some sort of, attached to some sort of like machinery because he's been shot. And so it leads us to the question, like, is this like when they found out that Krebs is Glitter Guy? Is this like, okay, Glenn's 100% involved in this? That's kind of what it feels like. And I've had a lot of theories in the past couple of videos that Glenn is the murderer or one of the murderers of SAZZ. And I think we're starting to see how he's connected to SAZZ. So in the last video I created, I did mention that I think that Glenn is most likely to be the murderer. And the reason that I feel that way is because of all the characters and the cast that we've seen this season. Glenn is the only one who shows up in the season, narrates an episode, but we don't actually learn anything about him. And every other person who's been in the show or narrated, we've either kind of taken them out of the running for being the murderers. Like, we don't think the Westies are the murderers. We don't think the actors are the murderers. So that leaves us with a limited number of people who are in the show enough to actually be the murderers. And although I know that Glenn wasn't in the show in season 1, so it might be hard to understand how he would relate back to the first season of Only Murders in the Building, I do think that he is probably involved or the murderer because of the way that we've now learned that he's related to SAZZ. He was SAZZ's protege and they had something go wrong. So is it possible that Glenn was involved in SAZZ's murder? I also wouldn't be surprised if Glenn ends up narrating another episode, whether it's this next one or the 10th episode, and we learn of his like full involvement in her murder. My theories before were that Glenn had something to do with Dudenoff's murder, but as we've learned, Dudenoff wasn't murdered. So we still have these plot holes that exist of like who was threatening the trio back then and why. And so the question is there another murder in the building that we don't know about that we're going to dive into in season 5? Or are we expected to think that the Westies were the ones threatening the trio because of the fact that they incinerated Dudenoff's body and they were afraid that they were going to be found out? It's hard to know, but it doesn't seem like the Westies did it because I feel like they would have mentioned that and admitted to it in this episode. So the question is, who was threatening the trio in the first season to stop their podcast? Why? And how does it connect to this season and SAZZ's murder? And so, like I said, I feel like Glenn is involved. At this point, I think that he's involved, but he's probably not the mastermind of who planned the murder. It doesn't seem like he's mentally all there and well enough to organize a murder. He just doesn't seem that smart. But there have been two theories floating around my head, and one is that Glenn is the murderer and someone else is his accomplice, and we're gonna learn that it's Bev Mellon, or we're gonna learn that it's the screenwriter or something like that. But the other theory is that Glenn is actually Ben Glenroy and that he is getting revenge for his, attempted murder or whatever, revenge on the trio for allowing him to almost die, and that maybe he doesn't even know he's Ben because he has this like trauma with rats. And so, he is like mentally not all there. So I think that's a possibility. Or Glenn himself is trying to get revenge for Ben's death because that was his face, that was his other half, and the trio kind of like let Ben die on their watch, and so maybe Glenn has decided that they deserve to be punished for that. Obviously, I don't think that the trio are to blame for Ben's death, but it's just something to think about. So that is all I have for you guys today. If you liked this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, hit the bell notification, all those YouTube things. Make sure to comment down below who you think the murderer is. I love to read your theories. It's so fun. And I love you guys so much. I will see you in the next one with another video. I cannot believe that it's already episode 9 and then it's gonna be episode 10. Season's almost over. It's insane. But I will see you guys next week. Love you so much. Bye.